In progress. Cool. So thanks again to Tom for coming to talk about it. He's currently Director of Public Affairs at the LANCAT and is also Governor at the Pension Policy Institute, and obviously has had a long career at Hargreaves Lansdown before that. So without further ado, I'll let Tom take the stand.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, I agreed to talk about pensions policy today, and I've had some conversations with Labour about it, but not a lot. And so my first disclaimer is most of what I'm going to talk about is quite speculative. There are some things we have heard them talk about and we do know they're thinking about, but really, so to echo Chris's comments, what I want to do is just lead a discussion around this. So I'm going to throw some ideas out. I've put a few slides together. There's some things I'm going to talk about. Please feel free to chip in, disagree with me, ask questions, make your own comments as we go along, because that I think will just make for a more entertaining session. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, if I can work out how to do that. Can you see? Hang on, let's do that. Oh, wrong one. Right, can you see those slides? Got a nod from Chris. I'll take that as a yes. Great. All right. So yeah, talk about Labour pensions policy and lifetime pensions. Do that. Right. So there we go. I thought it was just worth highlighting this. I mean, you all know this. I thought it was just a helpful reminder going into the general election. If you're going to make policy, if you're going to make stuff happen, generally, you need one of three things. You need either a consensus about what the right solution is to do next. If that's where the Overton window is and everyone agrees on that, then it's pretty simple to push stuff through. You need a crisis. Good examples of 2010 and the coalition government, or COVID. Let's just waste several £100 billion on a response to COVID. And everyone agreed that was a good idea, myself included. And so you can push it through. Or you need lots of political capital. And I think on that latter point, the size, let's assume for a moment we're going to get a Labour government. That seems at least a passing possibility. Then the size of the Labour majority and how Keir Starmer manages that Labour majority will become really, really important. I was struck by the fact Tony Blair, looking back at the '97 government, says, you know, he wishes he'd been. I think I'm right in quoting him broadly saying he wishes he'd been more radical, wishes they'd pushed more stuff through, particularly in that first term. And how much political capital Keir Starmer has will dictate how many difficult things he can get done. So the size of the majority will really, really matter. It also helps, you know, like making a chicken chasseur, first catch your chicken. It's really important to have a pensions minister. We don't currently have a shadow pensions minister. I mean, Jill Furness seemed like a very nice person. I'm sure was a good constituency MP for the citizens of Sheffield Brightside, I think it is. I'm not sure how engaged she was on pensions policy. My bet is, and I'll be proved wrong on this no doubt tomorrow, they actually won't appoint another shadow pensions minister, and they'll just shove Stephen Timms into the job on the other side of the general election. And I suspect most people on this call would not be unhappy if Stephen was the next pensions minister. I think he would do a very capable job. And it's also instructive, I'll come back to this in a minute, looking at some of the stuff the Work and Pensions Committee has been up to over the last few years. So, all right, so let's start with a review of pensions. I'm not proposing to have a review of pensions now, but I think it's interesting that is currently Labour's broad position on pensions. We'll have a review, and that itself I find is slightly alarming, that they've not even talked really about what that review would encompass, what it is they're thinking about. I would like to go into the next general election with some idea about what Labour's direction of thinking might be around the stuff they're going to bring into the review. But why would you make yourselves a hostage to fortune in advance of the general election, particularly if you're thinking about things like pension taxation? We've heard Rachel Reeves talk about the lifetime allowance. We'll come back to that in a minute. But it would be great, in my opinion, if Labour would actually give us some sense of what the scope of that review of pensions is likely to look like, what's in, what's out, what they're going to think about. But we'll get a review of pensions. Patrick says they're not thinking about pensions policy at all, hence the need for a review. Yep, agree with that. To me, that feels like they're going to waste time. You know, why are they not doing some of the intellectual work now rather than later? Anyway, let's do some of that for them. So stuff that's already happening that is likely to keep happening. New minister arrives in the department, and senior civil servants walk in and plunk a stack of files on the desk and say, right, this is what we're doing. And I think there are various things that they will just keep on doing. It's all about economic growth. I mean, really interesting to see the GDP numbers this week. All of a sudden, the economy is growing again. Hurrah! And I think that's really important because really the only thing that's going to get us out of this hole that we're in right now is economic growth. We now have 2 Henry Tappers. That's a rare privilege on this call. I think a lot of the focus will continue to be on productive finance. I'm not going to talk a lot about this today. If anyone else wants to chip in at this point and opine about how they're going to do that and what it's going to mean, okay, yeah, maybe we'll get a hung parliament, and in which case all bets are off and who knows what will happen next. So on the Mansion House stuff and the productive finance and the French TB scheme that they've talked about, that seems to me a nailed-on certainty. And actually there's not a huge difference between what Jeremy Hunt has said about this stuff and what Rachel Reeves has said about this stuff. They both want to use pension capital to stimulate economic growth, to make stuff, to grow things, to generate jobs. Con, please. You're on mute, Con.
There's a real problem with Mansion House and using pension schemes to drive growth, which arises from the shift to low dependency funding being required. There's an enormous difference between TPR's estimates of scheme assets and the ONS estimates. The difference is currently around £280 billion. The result is that if ONS are right, and I believe they are, as to the actual level of scheme assets, the pension fund sponsors are going to find themselves something of the order of £150 billion short of the low dependency funding level. That's going to put a real damper on the ability of UK PLC to invest other than by making contributions into their low dependency based schemes. It's a real problem. Ian and I have written to Labour on this and drawn it to their attention. It's potentially a real block for the whole growth and productivity agenda. One to think about.
Okay, we can always rely on you, Con, to just raise the mood a little bit. But
sorry about that.
No, thank you. Really good intervention, really good observation. That's not going to go down well with the people trying to stimulate the economy. And I have some sympathy with their perspective that we need economic growth. That's what gets us out of the hole we're in, and we need to find any mechanism we can, any levers we can pull to do that. But that's really interesting. Thank you for that. So yeah, institutional pooling will lead to that growth in theory. Consolidation of pension provision, consolidation of entities, that seems inevitable to me that will continue through mechanisms like the default consolidators. I know the work's going on that now. It's got quite a long way to go to get over the line, but consolidation of pots does seem likely to happen. Value for money. I can't see any of this changing significantly over the next couple of years. I don't see any political win or need for a new Labour government to deviate significantly from all this stuff that is currently in train. Likewise, dashboards, CDC schemes. I think this is kind of interesting. I sense, there's every time I have a conversation with anyone at the DWP, the conversation invariably always goes round to, yes, but how will this help us deliver CDC? I think, so I'm just reading Henry's comments. Okay, interesting. So yes, I think the consolidation agenda will continue, and yes, I think there'll be more of a push towards CDC. That socialization of investment and longevity risk through a CDC scheme seems to me like a no-brainer. And the only question mark that's been in my mind up until this point is how it's actually practically delivered. And I think a lot of the answers to that question are now being presented. Seems, we've got the consultation to come on commercial CDC schemes in the next couple of months. I can't see a reality in which Labour doesn't push ahead with this, if anything, even harder and faster than is currently the case. And that consolidation agenda, coupled with CDC, may start to solve some of the problems I've highlighted here. WASPI, right? So current government doing its best to kick that one into the long grass repeatedly, year after year. Labour have been saying they will do something about WASPI and throw some money at it. So I think that's something that might change under the new government a little bit, without, as far as I can tell, as yet, any clear articulation of exactly what Labour would do on WASPI, other than throw some money at it. But I would expect to see more movement on that front. Patrick, you're such a cynic. So yeah, perhaps. Okay, so auto enrollment. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? 2017 reforms still a priority. Labour supported the 2023 bill to enable the implementation of the two key reforms proposed in 2017. And yet here we are, it's still not been implemented. We're 7 years down the line from 2017. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that whilst we all agree there's an adequacy and a funding issue in the long term around pension provision, even getting 2017 over the line is proving challenging and problematic. But Labour have said they will support that, and I guess this is an area where, if the present government doesn't actually make further progress on this in terms of putting an implementation timeline in place, which they've not yet done, it'd be reasonable to expect that the Labour government might be better enabled to do that reasonably early in the new Parliament. So I'd look for that. I'm acutely conscious, though, that we still have a cost of living crisis. People's pay packets are pretty sensitive. Taking money out of people's pockets is never fun for a politician. So maybe you could set a time frame in the new Parliament for when they will move forward from the modest 8% we've got at the moment. Employer contributions, that seems an easier win for Labour. We've got a new government. Look, employers, can't you at least put in the same amount as your employees as a minimum contribution rate? That would seem a fairly soft target for Labour to start with, and they'll get pushback from small businesses in particular, but they could probably get that one over the line. To me, for now, 12% continues to look very, doesn't have to be 12%, but there's a general gravitation towards a consensus around 12% being something that looks like a reasonable number as a long-term contribution rate. Getting to that still looks really difficult to me in the foreseeable future. So I think under a Labour government, we'd probably make some progress on the 2017 reforms and maybe a little bit more, but getting much beyond that, I think for the foreseeable future still looks pretty challenging. Okay, I want to talk about pension freedoms, because I don't think enough attention has been focused on this recently. Billy sits up at this point, looks interested. So I just wanted to pick up on some of the FCA retirement income market data. We're 10 years on from pension freedoms, and I'm not sure it's working particularly well. If you look at the retirement income market data, it's striking that the single commonest transaction is for small pots of under £30,000 to be taken out as cash. In fact, those transactions, small pots under 30k being taken out as cash, outweigh all the other transactions, all the annuity purchases, all the drawdown, all the larger encashments put together. So currently, by transaction volume, the retirement market consists of small pots being encashed. And there are reasons why that won't persist in the longer term, but that's not a particularly good place to be right now. And it's not just small pots. There were a couple of hundred pots of over $250,000 taken out as cash in one go. And you know, I'd love to know what was going on there and why they felt the need to pay quite so much tax in one hit. There are thousands of pots of over £100,000 being cashed out in one go. And again, I'd love to know what exactly was going on that led people to think that, you know, that was what needed to be done right now in one hit, and why they felt compelled to give so much money to the exchequer. At the same time, we're seeing a decline in take up of pension wise. There's a loose correlation between pot size and take up of advice and guidance. So the bigger the pot, the more likely it is someone will get help with their pension pot. And if you're just taking out 5 or 10 grand, I can see that it makes sense that I don't need to go to pension wise. I certainly don't need to talk to a financial advisor. But you know, what we lack at the moment, and I think this is a real failing to date, is with one exception, because Ignition House have done a little bit of work on this, sponsored by People's Pension. But it's a pretty narrow study they've done of 50 people or so. There's no really comprehensive, authoritative analysis of the decision-making processes that people are going through in how they use their pension freedoms. And if they're taking financial advice, we can be reasonably confident they're getting a decent outcome. You know, we'll park that one. And if they're going to Money Helper or Pension Wise, again, hopefully they're making a better decision. But there are hundreds of thousands of people every year accessing their pension pots, and we've got no idea whether they're making a good decision or not. We don't know what other resources they've got. We don't know why they're taking the money out. They don't know whether they considered how much tax they're paying. We don't know whether they've got a DB pension to rely on. We just don't know. And to me, that is a huge failing. Billy. Billy, you put your hand up. Are you going to talk to us?
Oh, yeah. So I was just going to sort of chip in. I was going to write a note, but thought it was easier. I hear what you say about pension freedoms, and I think it's important just to say that with annuity rates, you know, going up, it makes the decision whether people are better off taking income by way of annuity or drawdown one of the most difficult questions in, you know, personal finance. When pension freedoms first came in, annuity rates were so poor it was basically a return of, you know, the original capital. But now, you know, we're back to a situation where we were, you know, a long time ago, where people do need, you know, proper advice. And I take your point about, you know, the decision making process. It's something that I've been involved in and writing about for ages. And, you know, it's very difficult to get people to really engage with the decisions at retirement. I think the thing about pension freedoms, it's made people very lazy, thinking that taking cash withdrawals or pension drawdowns is the default, when they're taking probably far too much risk. But I'll shut up now.
No, thank you for that, Billy. I think it's Yeah, agree with all of that. I think just final point on that one is the high levels of income withdrawal and drawdown. And again, we don't know what other money they've got, but for pension pot sizes, for drawdown pots of up to £250,000, the commonest rate of income withdrawal is over 8% a year, which is, I'm not a financial advisor anymore, but I'm pretty confident that's not sustainable in the long term. So there's a lot of people taking quite a lot of money out of their drawdown plans, and we don't know whether they've got a long-term plan that's going to ensure their financial stability into later retirement. And so come back to the original question, what will Labour do? If I were Labour, I would be looking at this saying, this is a problem. You know, we're not happy here. And, you know, cast your minds back to 2014 when Rachel Reeves was the shadow pensions minister. And my recollection of 2014 is Labour was initially slightly discombobulated, I think, as we all were, by George Osborne's announcement. And initially, Labour were quite oppositional to the pension reforms, and then kind of read the room and realised it was quite popular and kind of fell into line on it, but were never that enthusiastic about it. And so I think it's worth just keeping that in mind. And then since then, we've had a sort of rolling extension of defaults and guardrails through things like the simplified wake-up packs and investment pathways for people going into drawdown, and now default decumulation being reversed into trust-based pension schemes. So we've already got an environment where, from a regulatory point of view, we're trying to put our arms around people accessing their pension pots and help them to make better use of the money they've got. Yeah, absolutely agree with you, Robert, about the timing thing. Yeah, and agree they're not retiring. I mean, in fact, I agree with that. Looking at that FCA data, I would say there's broadly two things going on there. One is, and this is the bulk of transactions by number but not value, people treating pensions more like an ISA, people dipping in for cash and in the process paying some tax. And then there's a smaller market where people are buying annuities, taking drawdown, where they're taking a longer term sustainable income. And that's the retirement market. They're two quite different things going on with what is essentially, yeah, a long-term savings vehicle. And this then comes back to the question around consolidation of small pots and will people behave differently? And I think they probably would if we had one big pot rather than half a dozen smaller pots. So back to Labour, I think an extension of defaults and guardrails, possibly a gentle rethink around pension freedoms generally. You know, maybe the reintroduction of some kind of minimum income retirement or a bumping up of the age at which you can access pensions more aggressively, coupled with the enthusiastic implementation of CDC schemes, all with the intention of just boxing off that risk of people injudiciously tapping into their pensions in their late 50s, early 60s, and then regretting those decisions as they get into their 70s and 80s. To me, that seems a pretty inevitable direction of travel with Labour. David Blake wrote a review for Rachel Reeves back in 2016, I think. I seem to remember it was something like 500 pages long. It was an absolute monster. Perhaps more relevantly and more recently, I think it's worth looking back to our friend Stephen Timms, looking at the 2022 report from the DWP Committee on Pension Freedoms. It was their third report on the pension freedoms. And there's quite a lot of interesting stuff in there that sort of goes beyond pension freedoms and looks at sustainability of pensions more generally. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see Labour in their first term taking another look at pension freedoms and finding ways to extend those guardrails and those restrictions around what people can do with their pension pots. But tell me if you disagree. Okay, so both the DWP report and, interestingly, the Blake report kind of pointed towards a pensions commission. Jeannie Drake, who's clearly still pretty influential in terms of Labour's pension thinking, sort of said yes to a pensions commission. She was advocating for a permanent body to gather evidence and information and insights around pensions policy, which sort of perhaps arguably stops short of a commission as such. But I wonder whether that Labour review of pensions could evolve into something that looks like a standing commission, which was, of course, a recommendation of the original Turner Commission, is that we should have an ongoing commission to look at this kind of stuff. My sense is that now there are too many big questions that aren't being addressed for entirely understandable and legitimate political reasons. But just taking a few of the demographic change, well, we knew what the demographic picture looked like in 2006, that the population was getting older and was living longer. Interesting variations to that since 2006 are the falling fertility rate, which was much less of an issue 20 years ago. That birth rate is becoming an increasing problem in exacerbating that aging population phenomenon. And of course, we've got much higher levels of immigration now. And that's going beyond the remit of pensions, but hundreds of thousands of low-value immigrants coming in every year is not going to help the pension system. So the demographic shift is something that needs to be fed back into the mix of policy making in a way that I don't think it is at the moment. And that, of course, feeds through to the sustainability of the state pension and what we do with the triple lock, because arguably the state pension is both too high and too low. The triple lock is just this relentless juggernaut that's sucking more and more money into the state pension. And at some point, somebody's going to have to bite the bullet and say, let's come up with a different model for how we increase the state pension from here and how we set people's expectations of state pension increases. At the same time, it's not enough to live on. And so how you intersect the state pension and the sustainability of the state pension with housing and welfare and private savings and the phenomenon also that increasing numbers of people over the next 20 years are going to arrive in retirement not owning their own home is a real challenge to the sustainability of the auto-enrollment consensus. Because what's the point of reducing people's standard of living in the short term by taking money out of their pay packets today and putting it into a retirement savings account when they're going to be fairly heavily dependent on welfare in retirement anyway because they don't own their own home? And that wasn't a problem 20 years ago when auto-enrollment was proposed, but it has become much more of a problem now looking forwards. And of course, no one's talking about the social care problem and how we fix that. And I don't see how we can continue to, well, we can just muddle through as we are. But I would love to see a mechanism implemented which enabled the policymakers to take hold of housing, welfare, social care, the pension system, and look at it all in the round, because that, to me, doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. It's all very short-term and tactical, and no one's thinking strategically. And therefore, what do we actually want auto-enrollment to achieve? Because for people who no longer have access to a DB pension, there are lots of middle earners who absolutely need to be saving for their retirement, and auto-enrollment helps deliver that. What about the low earners? And what about the self-employed in the gig economy? Something Steve, the DWP report highlights is that we've done very little for the increasing numbers, the millions of people now who are not really being helped out by the auto-enrollment system. So I have this challenge of either stopping talking to read the commentary or so yeah, sounds like a real commission, even longer delay. Yeah. So that's always the risk, isn't it? You put another commission in place and everything gets kicked down the road another couple of years. I agree, but also I think it's very challenging for politicians who have by nature to think in fairly short electoral cycles to deal with this kind of stuff. And back to my earlier point around political capital, I think you can only deal with this kind of stuff if you've got a decent foundation to build from, if you've got a decent amount of political capital to work off. It's understandable that politicians go away and do other stuff instead, because it's really difficult and probably won't be popular. whatever you come up with. And one of the great virtues of the Turner Commission was that it forged a consensus. I mean, we had still a relatively weak opposition at the time. There was no upside to them in imposing what was being proposed by the Turner Commission, but it gave everybody the air cover of signing up to a consensus. There's this really authoritative piece of work, and it makes sense. And so we can all say, yeah, we'll fall into line behind that. And then we won't take political pot shots at each other for implementing these proposals. And absent that, there's always the risk that a government is open to being politically undermined by their opponents for implementing things that were unnecessary but unpopular. So that the regulatory architecture is just, I mean, it's a hobby horse of mine. So I've got no reason to suppose Labour is going to do anything about it. But we're moving towards a world of fewer, bigger, better run pension schemes, the slow runoff of DB, the implementation of CDC. We're heading towards certainly fewer master trusts, fewer own trust schemes, probably fewer contract-based insurance company and SIP provider group pension arrangements. There are going to be fewer pension schemes all round, and there's a convergence between trust-based and contract-based pensions. There's not that much difference these days between a group personal pension plan and a master trust, not in terms of what it does for the member. I appreciate there are governance differences in how they're run, but I would question whether the regulatory architecture we've got with the bits the pensions regulator looks after and the bits the FCA look after actually makes sense going forwards, particularly if we're going to move into a world of CDC pensions, which sort of straddle both worlds, because they're both a TPR proposition, a trust-based workplace solution, but they also work as a retail solution as well. So I think there are regulatory issues around that. So I would argue that as part of that savings commission, there's somebody could then have a look at how the regulatory system serves the pension system. Okay, let's talk a bit about pension taxation. Yeah, sorry, did someone come in there? No? Okay, so I was interested to see Steve Webb being quoted only this morning saying he still thinks that Labour will bring back the lifetime allowance, but possibly not first year. It'll have to be a second year thing. I'm not close to the nitty-gritty of how the lifetime allowance has been abolished. I've seen the pain etched on the faces of the people who have been close to it. It has been a staggeringly messy piece of policy making. We're still getting emergency updates, emergency draft legislative amendments being sent out by HMRC to correct mistakes made the first time round after the whole thing is up and running. You know, we're into the new tax year now. This is supposed to already be a thing, and they're still having to retrospectively fix stuff. There would be much wailing and gnashing of teeth if a new Labour government came in and said, yep, and you know what, we're going to reverse it all. We're going to bring the lifetime allowance back again. Could you nice chaps over at HMRC go away and just work out how you're going to do that? So I do wonder whether when they get in, and I know the last official position from Labour was, yes, we're going to reintroduce the lifetime allowance. I wonder whether when they do get there, they're actually going to have a bit of a rethink about that. And I mean, personally, I would argue it's not going to raise a lot of money for them. It's not going to make a huge difference to the revenue. It's pretty totemic stuff. I think the doctor's problem is not as pressing an issue now as it was then. And given where we're at with the annual allowance, you know, arguably you don't need a lifetime allowance as well anyway. So I think the logic of getting rid of the lifetime allowance kind of made sense. I question whether Labour will actually have the appetite to bring it back when they see how challenging it will be. However, I do think they will do stuff with tax on pensions. And to me, I don't know that they're going to do this, but to me, an easy win would be to just tighten up the back end taxes on legacy pension pots. The taxation of death benefits on pensions is still surprisingly generous. And that could be used as a mechanism to encourage people to think more about how they do accumulate their pension pots. By definition, we're talking about wealthier people here. and there is currently an incentive for wealthy people to hoard wealth in their pension pots, simply to pass it on to. Sorry, did someone come in there?
I think there's someone unmuted. I think.
Okay, all right, sorry. So it wouldn't surprise me to see them do that. I mean, look, there is no money left. Labour will need money. This seems like quite a good way to raise some money in a way that would potentially not affect most people. And actually, you know, depending on the size of their majority and just how much appetite for pain they've got, because again, it would be deeply horrible to do. But I wonder whether we'll see a more broad review of pension tax relief. A lot of work has been done on this in the past, a lot of talk around maybe some sort of flat rate top up as an alternative to the current tax relief system. There are reasons why the current tax relief system exists, but at the same time, it is taking general taxation money and effectively giving it to wealthy people who've already got quite big pension pots. And that's kind of hard to justify. And I wonder whether a new Labour government will look at that and say, why are we giving all these rich people all that money into their retirement savings when a lot of them don't actually need it? Can we do it a different way? Maybe a flat rate would make more sense. So I wonder whether the lifetime allowance thing will get wrapped into a broader review of pension taxation. But of course, we don't know, because they haven't told us what's going to be in their review yet. And again, I have some sympathy with Labour on that one, because the last thing they're going to do at this point is stick their heads over the parapet and say, I'll tell you what, we're going to do a review of pension taxation, because that would just give the Conservatives a stick to beat them with and to tell voters that they're going to their pension tax relief is not safe under a Labour government. But so why would they talk about that now? But I wonder whether perhaps they'll talk about it on the other side of the general election. Okay, so I'm proposing to move on to small pots at this point. Does anyone want to come in on any of the Labour policy stuff I've talked about thus far, or anything that I haven't talked about that I should have done? David, I'd have been disappointed if you hadn't chipped in at this point.
Yeah, so I missed the first 15 minutes. Apologies if I overlap with you, Sarah. I think this is all relevant to your last slide on tax. I mean, I think on lifetime allowance, it's worth reflecting the context in which Labour made their pledge to reinstate it. So this was Jeremy Hunt's March 2023 budget. It was 6 months or so after the kind of disastrous Truss mini budget, in which the government had, amongst other things, announced they were going to get rid of the 45p income tax rate, and had quickly had to retreat on that. And then on budget night in March 2023, Reeves was on I think it's the Peston programme, and was asked, "Are you going to bring back the lifetime allowance?" And she said, "Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's even going to come to that. I think this will all unravel, encouraging Conservative MPs in less affluent red wall seats to vote it down." I think Labour were trying to force another humiliating U-turn from the government, in which case this horrible technical problem of how you go about reinstating it wouldn't have arisen. And so I think they kind of made the pledge without knowing how they would do it, and subsequently, they've gone through a few iterations and that aren't that sure. But the one thing actually was interesting. I mean, Tom mentioned, wouldn't raise all that money. Reeves recently appointed a Troop, former head of HMRC, to work on this panel she's got advising on cutting down on tax avoidance. And when the lifetime allowance abolition was announced, Edward Troop tweeted saying, "Surprised by this Treasury costing, I thought it would raise a lot more than that." So I guess the kind of decision for Labour is, do we want to go into an election saying that we will raise this amount of money, and you may be getting some advice saying that there's more money on the table than the Treasury would say. And I guess the other thing, kind of more widely, is there seems to be a lot of issues. I mean, pension tax, kind of wider system of pension tax relief is one. Even the other day in a radio interview, when she was asked whether Labour would meet test for state pension, Labour using the line of "we have no plans to do it," which is a kind of fairly weak level of denial, leaving your options open. I think one of the interesting things as we get towards polling day will be where, you know, what kind of scare stories the Conservatives choose to run, get kind of more sustained questioning of this, and you know, where Labour decide they need to close down some options rather than just saying we've got no plans to do X, Y, and Z.
That'll make sense. Yeah. Thank you. Next one.
It's been really great canter across the pensions landscape. There's virtually nothing there that I would quibble with. But I feel forced to say something on taxation. I think they could easily propose a review of pension taxation. To actually do anything on pensions taxation would be a nightmare. I think once you start doing the figures, particularly to take into account of someone just commented, cut higher rate tax relief. Everyone's going to be paying higher rate tax fairly soon because of the frozen allowances. Certainly a lot of all the graduates who are now voting Labour will all be paying higher rate tax relief. It's a total nightmare as soon as you start doing any of the figures. And so a review is fine. The other point is Pensions Commission. I think the role of a Pensions Commission is what the original one actually did, which was set income standards for pensioners. And that's, if we could agree that and have a proper big debate on what income standards we are, a lot of the other issues fall into place because we then know where we're going and what needs to be done. And you could have a proper discussion. The problem at the moment is that the triple lock, I'm a strong supporter, but we need to know where it's going so that people can actually cost it properly.
I absolutely agree with that. And if we know, to your point, if we know where we're going, then we're just talking about how we get there rather than where we're trying to get to. And we don't even know where we're trying to get to at the moment. Yeah, absolutely agree. Andy.
Thanks very much, Tom. And I think that was, as Bryn said, a very interesting canter around everything. I just thought I'd put a slightly different perspective on it. And I agree with pretty much everything you said. I think it's worth looking back to 1997. So what happened very soon after Labour came in 1997, we had something that nobody had anticipated from an area nobody had even looked at from people who weren't into pensions, and that was the abolition of the recovery of ACT. Why did that happen? It'd be mainly, I think, originally because there was the desire to change the taxation system in companies. And then, of course, it was discovered that this could have an effect on pension schemes, and we know where we are from that. So there could be people working on things that we haven't thought of, a bit more left field, if you like to put it that way, than where we are now. Then what happened? We had not the Turner Review originally, we had the Tom Ross Review, which was a kind of preliminary canter around the houses, and I think set up enough hairs running within government, within the civil service who were working on it at the time, to pretty much come to a conclusion of what they wanted. And then they set up Turner's to report on that in a lengthy way. And I see similar possibilities this time. The reason, the other one point I wanted to make is that you didn't mention the kind of trap that the Tories have created for Labour by cutting national insurance by 4% for employees. Money will have to come from somewhere to pay for national insurance. It can come from general taxation, of course, the system allows for that, but nevertheless, it needs to be found. And that will be one of the prime things that we'll have to do early on, rather than a lot of the other details. I've made a lot of comments on various things, and anybody who follows me on Twitter or whatever, or is lucky enough to get my emails, will know I've got lots of other funny ideas, which I hope Labour will implement, but that will come some other day.
Good stuff. Thanks, Andy. John.
Morning, Tom. Yeah, thank you so much for that. The three big elephants in the room, as far as I can see, are the demographics.
So I'm going to interrupt you briefly, John. Charles, I see you got your hand up. We'll come to you next. Sorry, thank you. John, go on.
Okay, so the three big elephants in the room, as far as I can see, are the demographics, as you've highlighted. But they are appalling. I mean, frankly, we are in for a really rough time unless people start loving each other a bit more, shall we say. Secondly, the debt management office have got a real problem because they won't, the damage to the gilts market in terms of how to raise capital, raise money with the shift from DB to buyout is going to hit hard. And that's going to start to hit during the Labour term. And I think thirdly, the private versus public provision is going to come back on the agenda again, because they're the three big, massive elephants in the room as far as I can see. And the final point to do with the taxation, they can't alter high rate tax because the damage to judges, nurses, fire brigade, police, the societal issues will be something they cannot control and manage.
I don't disagree with you, and I think it's interesting that when George Osborne got the Treasury to look at this, what was it, 2015-16, and in the end they just said, "Oh, this is just too horrible. Let's do a lifetime ISA instead."
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't underestimate the horrors that await anyone who decides to try and look at pension tax relief. So yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it'll just be too. Maybe the inertia is just too great. Charles, you literally put your hand up, which is.
Yeah, well, it's like being at school. Thoroughly enjoyed the presentation thus far. My question is directed both to you, Tom, insofar as political capital goes, but particularly to Con and his observation about this humongous disparity between the ONS and the regulator in terms of assets and its potential impact on sponsors. So really, my question is, to what extent do you think, both of you, that the politics of high exposure will become involved? In other words, politicians taking decisions, but the implementation of them is in the longer grass, wherein they don't have to take the rap when they make that decision, and the people running the show, when it comes into effect, can blame the previous lot.
Well, it's always a popular strategy. Con, what are your thoughts? You're the expert in this.
Not sure I'm an expert in this. The problem, as I see it, that we have is that by moving to a low dependency funding rate, we are going to have deficits occurring, and the aggregate size of that deficit is something of the order of 150, maybe as much as 200 billion. Now, the legislation is all in place, and this goes ahead once we see the proposed DB funding code. So, we should be seeing implementation from the end of this September. Now, it's the demands on sponsors only actually arise if the pensions regulator insists that companies make deficit repair contributions relative to those levels. It's simple enough to give TPR an instruction, thou shalt not do this. So people are running deficits relative to their low dependency basis, fine, carry on. That will immediately relieve the pressure on companies to fund DB schemes rather than investing in their business.
Con, can I just cut in momentarily? I don't mean to be rude, but what is your reading of Stephen Tim's view on de-risking and LDI, etc.? Because doesn't that go straight to the point that you were raising?
Well, I think Tim sees leveraged LDI as having been an unmitigated mistake. Tim's is aware of the discrepancies between TPR and PPF numbers and those of the ONS, and has told the pensions regulator to sort it out. I don't know how much is actually going on between ONS and TPR in that regard. There have been one or two meetings, but my sense is that TPR are committed to believing in them, because I mean, it's logical that they should be committed to their numbers rather than the more likely ONS numbers, simply because TPR were one of the principal architects of LDI's widespread use, and leveraged LDI was permitted by them when it was almost certainly illegal. Where will Timms go? I'm not sure that Timms is the obvious candidate for pensions minister after Labour win an election. I would think, I get the impression that Timms is very happy where he is and would just like to continue running Work and Pensions Committee. A name which has been suggested to me a number of times has been Greg McClymont. And Henry, of course, wrote a blog on that this week, but I've heard the suggestion made by a number of people that they bring McClymont into the Lords and give him the pensions minister job there, very much as the Conservatives did with Ros Ortman.
Probably with more success. So
yes.
Interesting, yeah.
But as for where Labour policy is on this stuff, well, I mean, Matt Rodder was a total waste of time. During my career, I interacted with an awful lot of researchers and SPADs, and I have to say that Rodders were worse than useless. I think Labour's big problem is that they don't have a pensions policy. A review.
So I think just one other observation on that was, I think politically leaning over the TPR's shoulder and telling them how to do their job does carry risks. And I'm not saying they wouldn't do it, but if I were a minister, I'd be a little reluctant to go down that road, because that could blow up in your face further down the line. And maybe they would have to do that, but it's not risk free.
Okay, Tom, you do not need to worry about the response of TPR to such interference. You simply say, if you don't like it and you don't do what we say, we're merging you with the fucking FCA. And guess what? None of you are going to survive.
Well, I'd quite like to see that merger happen anyway, but that's another story.
Two of us.
Peter, I saw you had your hand up and now it's gone down again. Did you want to come in, or have you moved on at this point?
Thank you. I was just going to reinforce the point originally made by Con there, that there's a great confusion between contingent liabilities for deficits and actual liabilities, that companies tend to assume that the deficit they're shown is their actual liability, which is not the case. And as Con pointed out, the actual liability only is, to the extent, is the deficit recovery plan that the pension regulator forces on them. And there is a failure to understand the significance of that distinction. So, sorry, I'm a bit caught on my hop this morning, so I'm not expressing myself very well. But that was the point I was wanting to make.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bromwich. You're on mute.
So I am. I'm with you now. Elephants in the room. I spend a lot of time in universities talking to people about pensions. These are, people who are bright and so on and so forth. They really don't understand pensions. And when I talk to the sort of working staff, shall we say, in universities, the people who clean the place and all that, they don't understand either. But they've got a sort of feeling that auto enrolment plus the state pension will look after them in their old age. And that's really worrying, because it seems to me sooner or later somebody's going to wake up to the fact that's not the case. And I think that will be a big crisis around the corner. And I do feel that, basically we've got a situation where employees are paying more than employers. It doesn't sound very sensible to me or fair. So I am worried about the whole thing being a crisis to come, which I don't think you mentioned too much in your rather superb review. Thank you.
That's very kind of you, and I guess that comes back to Bryn's point around where are we trying to get to, and adequacy as a starting point. So look, we're at 11:29, which I'd rather than do small pots and injustice of trying to rattle through it in a minute. I think we've probably saved that for another day now. Chris, what do you think?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, that makes absolute sense.
So my apologies to anyone who really wanted to talk about small pots today. We can talk about the lifetime provider and how it's a much better idea than pot follows member on another occasion.
I just want to say thanks very much, Tom. That's been a fantastic run through. I know from my 25 years in pensions, I've learned a lot more about what stops pension changes coming through than what actually allows them through, and making things legal requirements. It seems to be the only thing. And yeah, looking forward to seeing what the new changes bring. But I'd just like to thank everyone for their input into what was a really interesting session and run through, and a massive thanks, Tom, because you've covered an awful lot of ground there in a really interesting way. Thank you very much. We've got the recording that will be going up live on the website later on today. So if anyone has missed the session, would like to catch up on it, then please let them point them in that direction. I know Steve, we've got another session coming up next week. I know Steve would like to thank everyone for attending, and give all our wishes and prayers for all the events that are happening in the world and in the East and the Middle East, and praying for peace out there. But I'd like to say thank you for everyone. It's been a really excellent and interesting session. Particularly thank you, Tom, for running through what may be happening after the next general election, whenever that may be.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your input.
Thanks all.